Good morning and welcome to this week's programme in which we mark the centenary of the birth of Conor Cruise O'Brien, writer, diplomat, politician, journalist. From the archives, his family background in the Irish Parliamentary Party, the death of his father, Frank Cruise O'Brien, on Christmas Day in 1927 when Conor was 10, his indebtedness to his older cousin, Owen Sheehy Skeffington, his time as an anti-partition propagandist, his time in Katanga, his decision to join the Labour Party in 1969, his ministerial career, the role of the intellectual in politics, and much more. Later this morning, this.
I sometimes think you must be sick of all the doctors collectively, that you wish that both Cruise O'Brien and Thornley and even Brown would be manacled together and tossed into the Liffey.
Well, that's later. But first a question. Did Conor Cruise O'Brien have any regrets in 1969 in abandoning his academic career, then based in New York, and returning to Ireland to begin a political career with the Irish Labour Party?
I think to move out of the purely academic world into the world of activity, political activity, is beneficial in some ways. I think it makes one think in a different set of ways about things, and I think one learns something from that. I've also enjoyed a lot of things in those years, including the comradeship and friendship of many people in politics. Got to know Ireland a bit better, both north and south, and with the possibility of comparing it with other places.
And what have you learned, would you say?
That's very hard, I think, to put into words. My feeling is of a sense of the resistances of historically acquired attitudes and the ingenuity of these attitudes in coming up and dominating people's thoughts. That's to say that even people who think they're talking rationally about a subject, as for example about the unity of Ireland, about the problems of Northern Ireland, are really much more often than not unconsciously echoing ideas conveyed to them atavistically. I think this Ireland is not peculiar in this way, but these forces, I think, are felt perhaps particularly strongly in Ireland, more than in certainly the advanced countries of Western Europe. Eastern Europe might be a better comparison in some ways. I felt the force of those things and have felt a kind of developing sense of tragedy as I experience them. I mean, there is some fun in politics some of the time, but there are also forces moving below the surface of politics which are not funny, make one anxious for the future, as I am now anxious.
Conor Cruise O'Brien talking there in 1979. Next, an interview a decade before, just after the 1969 general election.
I know I have a reputation which my critics have fostered.
And this was a reputation for?
Extreme, virulent ambition. People who know me well, as a matter of fact, I don't think have that impression of me. I would like to be a member of a Labour government in due course. I would be very happy and proud to be that. But this is a movement in which I'm working with colleagues and very happy to be working with.
And this was in 1969, just after he'd become a TD.
My family background, my family has been involved in Irish politics since my grandfather's day. My grandfather was a member of the old Irish Parliamentary Party from 1885 to 1918, and we've always been a politically minded family. And indeed, the atmosphere in which I grew up was one in which it was always represented as being the best thing that a person could do in life was to seek to represent the Irish people and be politically active in their service.
Let's pause there for a moment and visit a radio talk in which Conor Cruise O'Brien recalled the shock in 1927, when he was 10, of his father's sudden death that Christmas.
My father had been an agnostic. We lived in Dublin. Agnosticism ran in the family a bit. My mother's eldest sister and her son Owen were agnostics too. All the rest were Catholics, traditional, tridentine. My mother had tried being an agnostic out of loyalty to my father. When he died, she gave up and went back to being a Catholic. She also started to pray hard, very hard, even for an Irish Roman Catholic. She started praying on Christmas night, 1927. The reason why she started praying on that particular night was that my father died that morning, suddenly, of a heart attack, while bending a bow for me, my present from him. You can forget about the bow. The important word, as any Roman Catholic reader sees instantly, is suddenly. There was no time to send for the priest. If there had been, my mother would most certainly have asked my father to send for him, and I believe he would have sent for him, mainly because he knew it would be a comfort to my mother, and therefore to me. For the same sort of reason, James Joyce, another Dublin Catholic agnostic, but of much stricter obedience than my father, felt able to tell his little sister that their mother was in heaven. Being a live agnostic was not then, and is not now, taken very seriously in Ireland. Not very long ago, a prominent Belfast Catholic revealed to his parish priest that he, the PBC, had become an agnostic. The man of God kept his cool. "You're not an agnostic, Paddy. You're just a fat slob who's too lazy to go to Mass." But to be an agnostic who had died without the priest was in 1927, and for years afterwards, a much more serious matter. Everybody we knew well was kind to my mother about this. They explained to my mother that my father would certainly go to heaven because he had lived a good life. These reassurances were in themselves alarming. What my mother was worried about was not whether my father would go to heaven. She took that for granted. But when he would get there. The great question, in fact, was purgatory, a thriving institution at the time. My mother did not believe, as a less educated widow in her position might have believed and would have been told, that her husband was undergoing a course of physical torture somewhere under the earth. She believed that he might be separated from God. It was not the separation from God that worried her, it was the separation from her. By her bedside I saw for the first time in early January 1928 a manual of devotion, In Heaven We Know Our Own, by Father Blott, S.J. I didn't need to read the book. The title was enough. You see, to know your own in heaven, your own have to get there. And I knew that the date of my father's arrival at that destination was problematical. The reason for that was myself, because my father, besides being an agnostic and dying without the priest, had done something much worse. He had sent me to a Protestant school because he thought Protestant schools were better than Catholic ones, which they were. My mother was told that if she prayed, she could shorten my father's term in purgatory, so she prayed like mad. But she was also told that every term she kept me on at a Protestant school lengthened my father's term of suffering. She wouldn't take me away from that school because it had been my father's wish that I should go there, and that was that. Every day of her life was shortening, lengthening, praying, and holding firm with heroic fortitude.
After the death of his father, when Conor Cruise O'Brien was aged 10, his relationship with his older cousin, Owen Sheehy Skeffington, became ever more important. He was something of a father figure, as perhaps can be gleaned in this evaluation when Owen Sheehy Skeffington died in 1970.
Owen, I think some people mistakenly thought of Owen as somebody who asserted unpopular ideas because he wanted some form of martyrdom. This was very far from being the case. Owen was a games player, and a games player of this particular dogged kind I've described, and he did want to win. He wanted to win his own game, not someone else's, and according to strict rules which he laid down for himself. But on these terms, he did win. He wanted to get a message across. He didn't want political power. He did want moral and intellectual influence, and he wanted to have it among his own people. And that is what he did. He was content with the progress and development of his life. He was, I think, an unusually happy man, more fulfilled in his life than most people are. A great deal. But
I think it was a well-rounded life, and a life which goes on in the memories to an unusual extent of people who knew him. He evoked, I think, more sincere and complete admiration for his character than anyone else I have known.
After Sandford Park School, Conor Cruise O'Brien went to Trinity College, Dublin, where he was a member of the student branch of the Labour Party.
I belonged to the Labour Party from 1937 to 1942, when I joined the civil service. And as you know, when you join the civil service, they put you in the freezer, and you're not supposed to belong to a political party. But I was always in sympathy with the policies behind the Labour Party.
He always enjoyed options in terms of his career, not only the role, but also where he would live and work.
Well, I've always wanted to be here in this country if there was something worthwhile for me to do. I didn't feel that I wanted to stay here if it were a question of opening doors for Fianna Fáil ministers or something of that kind. I thought there was something better for me to do and more interesting for me to do, and these things in fact presented themselves outside the country.
As an Irish diplomat, he had worked at the United Nations. This now is a reference to the fact that he was then seconded to the then Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, as his personal representative in Katanga.
The Prime Minister of India, Mr. Nehru,
And this was his statement to the world press in 1961 when he resigned.
with all the great moral authority of Gandhi's heir, and with his profound knowledge of the international scene, has now confirmed the statement I made on my resignation. This means that it will no longer be possible for the British government to brush aside the important truths contained in that statement with the mere assertion that they were made by an unimportant man.
Which is what the British had called Dr. O'Brien. He was now also resigning from his role as an Irish diplomat from the Department of External Affairs, and he wrote to Katanga and back.
Mr. Macmillan will, I think, be obliged to answer Mr. Nehru. It will be interesting to hear what he will find to say.
Between 1962 and 1965, he was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ghana. He was then Professor in the Humanities at New York University from 1965 to 1969. Nollaig McCarthy, in this Speak Your Mind interview, asked him whether, after his time in Ghana and in New York, whether he wouldn't find Irish politics somewhat parochial.
I don't think so at all, Noel. I think all politics, when they're real, are based on a territory or locality, people, and these aren't really any more small scale in one place than in another.
She also asked him what sort of reception he'd received when he went knocking on doors looking for votes in Dublin North East.
Well, it was a strange experience at first because it was new to me. I didn't really feel uncomfortable. I feel if you knock on somebody's door and are asking for their vote, you shouldn't be throwing your weight around or addressing them as if they were a public meeting.
And what of his expectations as an opposition politician?
The late Frank O'Connor was advised by Harold Macmillan to choose between being a writer and public service.
His preoccupation with the North made him one of the most prominent controversialists in Irish politics in his first term as a TD. He challenged other parties' positions on the North. This was the 1969 to 1973 period, an era which covered the arms crisis, the arms trial, the formation of Provisional Sinn Féin and the Provisional IRA, and when the death toll in the North was at its height. And there were differences within the Labour Party itself on policy, differences which came to the platform of the Labour Party's annual conference in Wexford, where he was challenged by David Thornley.
I sometimes think you must be sick of all the doctors collectively, that you wish that both Cruise O'Brien and Thornley and even Brown would be manacled together and tossed into the Liffey and solve a lot of problems.
Ours is not a sham unity. Again, I say there may be people who have reservations about this.
There may be people who will come to this rostrum or raise their hands with bitterness or personal malice against Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien. This is not true in my case. The utmost admiration for Conor. I think his attitude to the North is unfortunately incorrect, I think he is one of the finest intellects in Western Europe, and on every other liberal issue of contraception, divorce, community schools and everything else, I would be found standing with Cruz O'Brien and against his enemies, and I want to make that clear.
What came through, and I'd like to stress this, was the spontaneous, unmistakable support from the floor by more than 4/5 of the delegates for the unequivocal repudiation of violence and of both wings of Sinn Féin IRA. This has been the topic around which the contention has gone, and there was no mistake about the verdict of the delegates on that, none at all.
He was always aware that in his own younger career as a civil servant he had participated in the anti-partitionist crusades of the late 1940s.
I was a councillor in on the information side of the Department of External Affairs, as it then was, under Mr. Sean McBride, who was very convinced then of the possibilities of what departments of foreign affairs call information and other people call propaganda as a means towards that end. And in the earlier part of those few years, I shared that enthusiasm, and then I became quite disenchanted and disillusioned about that. What I noticed was that whereas what we were supposed to be about was persuading Ulster Protestants of their interest in unity and the place for them in unity, we actually made no real contacts with them and addressed no real words to them. We were addressing other people in the United States and in Britain whom we hoped to be about to apply pressure to Northern Unionists to change their strongly held, inherited attitudes.
But your doubts at that time, were they felt, are you saying, during the course of that work, or was it some years later when you'd left the country and were working abroad?
I was certainly beginning to feel them during the course of that work, and at a later phase of the same work, while I was still working for External Affairs, when under the second inter-party government I was in charge of both the political and information side, I urged that in the United Nations the Ireland should concentrate not on political unification or pressure for unification, which I saw by then certainly, and this was the mid-50s, as entirely negative. But I thought that activity directed at remedying the situation of Catholics in the North and removing their disabilities without pressure for political unity would be legitimate and would stand a chance of getting somewhere, which was in line to some extent with ideas which I believe Sean Lemass certainly had in mind in the years of the rapprochement with Terence O'Neill.
Meanwhile, during his career as a politician, Conor Cruise O'Brien remained a writer. Essays, books, and books on a wide range of subjects came from his pen. He discussed the challenges of being a writer and a politician in this Books and Bookmen interview with Kevin Casey.
Dr. O'Brien, could I start immediately by asking you if, in your opinion, your participation in party politics and in government has compromised? You compromised your own disinterested and speculative freedom as an intellectual.
Well, I think politics is to a great extent, obviously, about compromise. And Edmund Burke, I'm going to paraphrase him because I don't remember the exact words, it's a rather complicated sentence, but what he says in substance is we must practice an economy of truth that we may live to tell it the longer. So he at least gives his blessing to certain kinds of compromise. But that is a difficult field. I mean, I think an intellectual has a role in politics, a writer has a role in politics, and may be useful as a sort of catalyst in politics. But he plays that role at his peril, and he should recognize it when he goes in. And it's all kinds of different perils, including an intellectual peril, because the politics of agreement, whether you're working with a party or in a government or whatever, it does involve, I mean, it's part of the actual process is papering over differences that are actually there, fudging things a bit. I don't regard that as a heinous activity, but it's not an activity that is good for intellectuals, and it's not an activity that intellectuals feel happy with. So I think those are among the risks involved.
How do you define the role of an intellectual in politics?
Well, insofar as he remains an intellectual in politics, he will have to be challenging some received ideas. Otherwise, he might as well stop being an intellectual and be an ex-intellectual in politics, and there are some of those around. But if he wants to retain that dual role and have the impact of his mind, what he thinks is important, his imagination, if he wants that to be felt in politics, he has to take kinds of risk which other politicians, quite rightly from their point of view, are not taking. And it's a bit of a tightrope to tread, certainly.
That presumably has to be balanced against what one thinks of as the inevitable expediencies and eclecticisms of party politics and presumably of ministerial office.
It has, yes. I mean, I suppose what you do is, any intellectual in politics, there will be for him certain areas which he regards as vital and no compromise zones. And there will be other areas in which he pipes down and at least silently acquiesces in the necessary fudging. And those areas can be of quite different dimensions.
One of your earliest books, Parnellin's Party, a book which I think still remains the standard text on the subject that it discusses, is, I suppose, a perfect example of disinterested scholarship. And I'm just wondering whether, now that you have been so actively involved in politics and now that you have developed a particular interpretation of Irish history, would it, do you think, be possible for you to write a book of that sort again, or would your work in history inevitably be more polemical?
It would, I suppose, be possible for me to write it, but I wouldn't wish to write that sort of book again. It was, of course, the core work on that was done as a PhD thesis and was done within the salutary constraints which universities impose on people who are doing those things. And I worked within those constraints at that time, and probably they were good for me. I think they were. And it produces work of a certain kind, which is very valuable. I mean, I'm not saying that book is valuable, but the type of work involved is valuable. But I suppose as you get older, I suppose perhaps more egoistic, you want to say what you feel yourself and think yourself about the transactions. I don't know that I would have the patience any longer to draw up little tables of professions to which members of a political party belonged and sort them out into groups. And I'm rather sceptical about the actual value of doing so. I think even in that work, such insights as were more imaginative were of more actual historical value also. And it's along those lines that any further work in that area that I will do will be.
Talking to Kevin Casey on books and bookmen. Elsewhere in the archives, Conor Cruise O'Brien discusses his ministerial career as Minister for Posts and Telegraphs in the Liam Cosgrave-led Fine Gael Labour Coalition of 1973 to 1977, and about the loss of his seat in the 1977 general election.
Insofar as I was damaged by the issue of the North, it wasn't so much what I was saying, but the fact that I was saying so much about it. Those people who reacted in that way, certainly among my own constituents, there weren't very many of them, incidentally, but those who did react were on the line that they didn't want to hear about Northern Ireland. But of course I think mainly their frustrations were about the postal services and telephones, for which in those days I bore the blame.
And in an interview with me on RTE television in 1979, I asked him about whether he might write about his time in that government.
What about books? I mean, are you writing, for instance, a book about your time in Irish politics?
No, I am not.
Did you keep a diary when you were in Irish politics?
No, I deliberately didn't.
Why deliberately?
It seemed to me that though I had written after my United Nations time, I had written about that, and I never kept a diary even in those days. I'd used letters and so on that I had. This was a situation, the one where I felt I had to write, was in a way forced on me, because the United Nations Secretariat was issuing a version of events in which I had been strongly involved, which was not true, and I had to burst out of that. On the other hand, to sit down at a table with one's colleagues in a coalition government and to do what Richard Crossman did, that is to say, cold-bloodedly write down what people were saying in what they hoped was confidence, with the deliberate advance intention of revealing all these things to the world in due course. That didn't seem to me quite compatible with the good faith of colleagues, and I felt that possibly the more particularly in a coalition situation. Anyway, I so decided. My motives may not have been as pure as I'm now suggesting, though I think that those motives were in them, but I'm also fairly lazy, and I didn't quite have Dick Crossman's energy of that kind.
But would you like to sort of tell, I mean, I take that point, but would you like to also tell the truth in a broader, another sense, as it were, about those years and write about them?
Yes, that I might do in a general way, without more or less in accordance with what they call Chatham House rules here. That is to say, situating tendencies and schools of thought, but not quoting individuals directly. That, of course, would be less interesting than the other course, but I think the general points I've made apply.
This morning's programme was to mark the centenary of the birth of Conor Cruise O'Brien, and more from the Cruise O'Brien archives next Sunday morning, along with other subjects. This morning's programme was based on original programmes by Kevin Casey, Nollaig McCarthy, Peter Feeney, Conor Cruise O'Brien and myself. More voices from the archives at the same time on Sunday morning next. Thank you for listening this morning, and good morning. And Conor Cruise O'Brien, his views on the media, on the Herima kidnapping, on not allowing Kader Asmal to run his conscience for him, and we hear the range of his views on Irish unity. Later this morning, this.
In a sense, in a very diffuse sense, I hold that aspiration myself. I would like to see an Ireland united by free consent, yes.
Later this morning, how Conor Cruise O'Brien adopted many policies on Irish unity, some of them a surprise to those who did not always read the motivation behind his changes of mind.
This followed the publication of extracts from his memoirs of the weekend.
For instance, this view towards the end of his career, which we'll hear more about later.
Dr. Cruise O'Brien wrote that in certain future circumstances, Unionists should consider joining a united Ireland as a lesser evil than civil war or an exodus to Scotland.
And the full context of that later. Conor Cruise O'Brien began his career as a diplomat in the then Department of External Affairs, working on anti-partition propaganda for Sean MacBride. It was a period when any deviation from the orthodox analysis was frowned upon.
That it became possible thereafter to say things that would have before been so heretical as to be inaudible.
As we heard in last week's programme, Conor Cruise O'Brien's central preoccupation in the 1970s concerned the Northern Troubles. As a minister in the Fine Gael Labour coalition in 1973 to 77, he took every opportunity to talk of the dangers to the Republic.
And I think the only thing that can enable a government to win through in that struggle is to make it clear it is absolutely useless making terrorist blackmail demands to this government because they won't work.
Talking here in the context of the prolonged kidnapping of Dutch industrialist Dr. Theda Herrema, when the kidnappers published a list of demands of the government.
I think that's the best hope of stopping them.
And the consequences of giving in, say in the Herrema case now, what would be the consequences?
Well, you can imagine the consequences. I mean, it is, I think, very strange that anyone could even consider that we could give in. The demands are persistent for release of 3 people who have been convicted of offences and are imprisoned and are associated with an illegal and violent organisation. Well, if we let them out, well, quite obviously, that organisation or members of that organisation then give us another shopping list and kidnap somebody else and repeat the threat, and this time with much more determination to kill if necessary. And if we don't give in to that, well, we're repeating what's happening now. If we do give in, we might as well release the whole lot and in effect hand over control in this country to the IRA.
And looking back on the 1970s in this television interview in 1979, I asked him about his repetitive foreboding about the danger of civil war arising from the Northern Troubles.
Your critics, though, in Ireland, and they've said it again this week, hold that your constant warnings in recent years about the danger of civil war were exaggerated, alarmist, even boring. And anyway, they say that you by now have been proved wrong.
I don't see how I have been proved wrong. The violence continues. In recent months, it has shown ominous signs of escalation. The pressures towards political unification, particularly pressures from America, continue and encourage the people who are committing the violence to go on keeping it up, in the hope that the British will to remain will eventually crack, so that the kind of scenario that I have had in mind, that has haunted me literally, of a civil war in Ireland in which the Republic would be drawn in, is certainly as vivid as ever. And I don't really think that most of my critics have thought as much about this as I have, or care about it as much as I do. I think their attitudes are, for the most part, frivolous and superficial, and based on unquestioned hereditary nationalist assumptions.
The aspiration to Irish unity you have characterised variously as diffuse, elusive, persistent, cryptic, lightly pervasive, a chronic mist. But could it not be said that in exactly that form, for constitutional parties to hold the aspiration is somehow safer than to hand those best lines in the Irish script over to the provisionals?
I don't think it works that way, John. I think that when people hold the aspiration for unity, all right. In a sense, in a very diffuse sense, I hold that aspiration myself. I would like to see an Ireland united by free consent, yes. But I think the possibility of that very remote. And I think that people who go on from holding an aspiration, which is quite legitimate, to pressure towards unification in our time, are engaged in a kind of mischief which doesn't take the issue away from the IRA, but helps the IRA and encourages the IRA to keep it up. And I really don't see how one can avoid that conclusion. If somebody thinks differently about that, would that person just try to put himself imaginatively in the shoes of the IRA godfathers as they hear statements, certain statements coming from America and from the Republic? Mr. Tip O'Neill says that arms should not be supplied to the RUC. Mr. Michael O'Kennedy agrees with him. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan says, and this all happened within 1 week, Senator Moynihan says that America wants to see Irish unity and will not be endlessly patient about it. How does an IRA godfather receive those words? What is he likely to do with them? What he's likely to say, he's likely to use those words and other statements like them to show to his young men, his squads of killers, keep it up, you're winning, don't be discouraged, the Republic is basically on our side, America is on our side, we're going to win. A morale-building message of very great power. So I don't honestly see how anyone can pretend that such words don't help the IRA to sustain a level of violence which they have now managed to keep up for, I think, the longest period in all their history, a sustained period of offensive, destructive violence. Contemplating that, I find it hard to see how people can be as complacent as many politicians are in the Republic, both about the present and about the future, and about the effect of their own words. And they are rolling in complacency. They are wallowing in it.
The occasion of this interview, it was on RTÉ television, was Conor Cruise O'Brien's appointment in 1979 as editor-in-chief of the Observer newspaper.
As everybody in the media knows, entertainment is part of the thing. That is to say, if you bore people, your ratings drop or your circulation drops or whatever. And also it is intrinsically unpleasant to bore people. It's not a thing one wants to do. And in particular, if one is a communicator, like you and me, we don't want to do that. So you can always make that classification. I think in a newspaper like the Observer, what one tries to do is to inform, instruct, and entertain. And if you can do all those things simultaneously, so much the better. There are, of course, great philosophical problems there because the entertainment is always in danger of getting in the way of the information. And that does apply to the media, generally speaking, I think.
Remarkably, you have dabbled in, and more than dabbled, in so many careers. Writer, diplomat, you've been in academic life, both as an administrator in Ghana and as a teacher.
That's right.
And in Irish politics, and now you're back as a writer, really, and in journalism.
I've had a very peculiar career, but it has all been involved in one way or another with communication, with the effort to communicate, with the difficulties of communication, with the analysis of problems of communication, and so on. I think even in my historical work that has been the case.
But do you see yourself then, some people have said, you see, that you are essentially a writer, and that, for instance, when a politician, when it might have been, in a sense, more politic and cuter to keep silent, that you blurt out the truth as you see it?
I would accept that criticism fully. I think it is true. I think, in a sense, an intellectual in politics is either something of an anti-politician. That's to say, he gets involved in the critique of the actual political context in which he finds himself, which is a rather dangerous activity, I agree, though I think possibly sometimes a useful one. Or he succumbs to that context and ceases to be an intellectual and becomes a politician pure and simple, as some of, for example, the intellectuals in the court of John Kennedy did. I think I took the first course rather than the second, and I'm glad of that.
In 1987, another controversy when he accepted an invitation to lecture at the University of Cape Town. This claimed Kader Asmal was breaking the cultural boycott of South Africa, which Dr. O'Brien had supported as a senior member of the Irish anti-apartheid movement. David Davenport spoke to both men on Morning Ireland.
Well, does it not sit a little uneasily with your previous espousal of the aims of the Irish anti-apartheid movement?
It doesn't sit at all uneasily. When I became a sponsor of the Irish anti-apartheid movement back about nearly 30 years ago now, I guess, this was an open movement run on liberal lines, and nobody at that time would have dreamed of boycotting scholars or universities. That simply would not have been on.
Well, Kader Asmal has a thing or two to say about that.
I'm not with it, and if I am required, in order to remain with the Irish anti-apartheid movement, to join in an academic boycott, I'm not doing it, and I would much rather resign or be put out of the anti-apartheid.
Kader Asmal.
Come off it, Dr. O'Brien. You became chairman in 1970. In 1968, 150 Irish academics signed a declaration saying that they will not work.
Well, I wasn't
in
one
South
of them,
Africa.
Kader, and I would never be one of them.
No, you may not have been one of it, but you were part of a movement that had openly espoused and supported a campaign.
Your idea of being part of a movement and mine are totally different.
No, I'm
you
not
need to look at it in a totalitarian
No,
spirit.
no,
The
nonsense.
movement owns you.
This is perverse.
Your movement doesn't own me, Conor, and it never will.
Please, don't ride high horses. This is a perverse argument. The argument is not whether to persecute individual academics in South Africa. And for your information, your tarring and feathering example that you gave in the Wapping Times, it is not the only one. There have been academics who have been murdered from the University of Natal. There have been academics in the University of going to Cape Town.
And that's the reason for boycotting them.
No, excuse me, who have asked for the boycott. Rick Turner did.
I haven't heard any South African academics out there.
But I think your choice for a scholar is very selective. There's Ray Hoffenberg, who chairman of the Liberal Party of South Africa, whose work could not be published in South Africa. Your academics who kept quiet about it.
You seem incapable of understanding that an individual can make up his own mind.
Of course.
And is not governed by resolutions or pronunciamentos or letters signed by 150 or 50,000 people.
Dr. O'Brien, I think the abuse is getting a little bit personal, if I may say so. What about the issues involved here?
Yes,
I mean, surely, as somebody who has been in favour of the aims of the anti-apartheid movement, really, you have performed a volte-face.
What rubbish. There is nothing in the principle of being anti-apartheid that requires one to boycott a totally desegregated university. There is no volte-face involved here. I'm completely consistent.
He remained a prolific author, essayist, lecturer and journalist, the most contrary Irishman since Bernard Shaw, some said. Then in the closing stages of the peace process, which he characterised as insidious and demoralising, a surprise.
After an absence of nearly 20 years from active politics, Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien has confirmed that he's willing to let his name go forward as a candidate in the forthcoming elections in the north.
His friend and founder of the UKUP, the United Kingdom Unionist Party, Robert McCartney, had invited him to let his name be put forward as one of their candidates for Stormont. Conor Cruise O'Brien assented and told Charlie Bird why.
I'm very concerned about the future of this island under the so-called peace process, and I feel I learn more about that by participation in all-party negotiations, if it comes to that.
So is Dr. O'Brien now a nationalist or a unionist?
But I came over the years, particularly since the outbreak of the Provisional IRA offensive in 1971, I came to feel that the whole nationalist agenda, insofar as it's aimed ultimately at incorporating Northern Ireland, is dangerously mistaken. I am, therefore, prepared to be a United Kingdom Unionist candidate in this election.
So at 78, the man who's known to many as the Cruiser could well find himself back on the political stage again.
And he was elected, but then his value to Robert McCartney at Stormont was undermined by what he had published in his latest book. On Morning Ireland, David Handley.
This followed the publication of extracts from his memoirs at the weekend. Dr. Cruise O'Brien wrote that in certain future circumstances, Unionists should consider joining a united Ireland as a lesser evil than civil war or an exodus to Scotland.
This was heresy for Unionists, and it prompted a banner page one headline in the Sunday Independent. When Robert McCartney spoke at Stormont, Ulster Unionists seated in front of him could not resist the temptation to hold the Sunday Independent in line with the TV cameras. David Davenport.
Well, ridicule is a powerful weapon in politics, and it was quite clear that the extracts from Conor Cruise O'Brien's memoirs were going to be used by political opponents of Bob McCartney. We saw Michael McGimpsey, for instance, in the Assembly on Monday holding up a copy of the Sunday Independent headline rather pointedly behind Bob McCartney as he was speaking. Very comical, but Mr. McCartney didn't see the joke.
McCartney regretted but understood Cruise O'Brien's resignation.
Here is, whatever we may say about him, a towering figure in Irish politics and literature, someone who treads the world stage, one perhaps almost uniquely in that category, a supporter of the unionist cause, who has been removed from directly participating in pro-union politics by the antics of a series of political pygmies who, bearing in mind the remarks of David Trimble, he must be included among them. I mean, Conor Cruise O'Brien is not only a close political ally and colleague of mine, whom I admire in terms of his intellect and his personality. He has been a great servant of democracy in Africa, in the Middle East, in the United States, and in Ireland. He's a man for whom I have a huge admiration. He is also my close, much-loved friend, and therefore I would hope that at some time in the future he will return, not only, he will never go out of my friendship, but he will return to the political scene in which I operate.
Robert McCartney concluding that feature on Conor Cruise O'Brien to mark the centenary of his birth, just 100 years ago. And also Miles Dungan's history programme at 6 o'clock tonight on Radio 1 will feature Conor Cruise O'Brien.